Hello, today I'm sketching the stables at Hall Place Gardens in Bexley. It is a 17th century stables and it now houses the Miller and Carter Steakhouse and an art gallery. I have visited Hall Place quite a few times and I like going back there all the time to sketch. This is a scene that I have sketched on site a couple of times. I have also painted this before. I always start with a quick pencil sketch. I don't give a lot of details when I'm using pencil, but this is just to guide me the main perspectives really, so I don't get that wrong. So I just do the stables or the house structure first. The reference picture that I'm using here was taken by me when I was there last time and when I was sketching there this exact scene. It was a nice and sunny yet a windy day, and I was able to create quite a windy quick sketch while I was there. I will share the reference picture in the community section of my YouTube channel. The structure of the building is long rectangular in shape with a roof on top. It also has two structures sticking out of the longer side of the rectangle. My focus here is the corner of the building with a shrub that sits right at the corner. I also like the tiny door and the low roof. I'm quite happy with the pencil sketch that I have here, so I'm going to start off with some watercolors. I'm using a mixture of Pyrolle Orange and a little bit of Indian Red. You could use burnt sienna if you like. I just like the brightness of Pyrolle Orange, which I wanted to show here as well. So just topping it up with a little bit more Indian Red. It's the same color for the other side of the building as well, but if you see in the reference picture, it's quite in the shadow. I'm going to give a layer of the color here for now, and I will finish it off with some shadow colors later on. Now for the roof, I'm going to do a mixture of Indian Red and Ultramarine Blue with a little bit more of Ultramarine Blue to give me a sort of deep grey purple shade for the roof. Working my way around the tree shape. And it's quite a light wash comparatively, as I don't want any dark colors here. I can see that the sun is hitting directly onto the roof. I'm using the same color of the roof to do the sides of the building as well, just to suggest roof a little bit of shadow. And I like the way the colors bleed into the orange of the wall. And for the roof that are sticking out from the main roof, I'm going to use a little bit more Indian Red with a touch of ultramarine blue to tone it down. I'm going to start working on the foliage of the tree in the corner, starting off with a little bit of lemon yellow. And then I'm going to simultaneously use a little bit of olive green. If you don't have olive green, you can also use a mixture of sap green and alizarin crimson red to give a muted green, which is exactly the color I'm looking here. So I'm working wet in wet, dropping in some green where I have placed the orange. I'm also going to add some deeper green this time, less water, more pigment, but it's the same mixture of sap green and alizarin crimson red. Or if you're using olive green, I have mixed a tiny bit of red as well as ultramarine blue to give me a very deep color, but lesser amount of water compared to the first wash I did. I can also see that the lemon yellow that I used has bled into the roof color as well, leaving a tiny bit of cauliflower effect, but I'm not really going to bother that because I'd like the colors to bleed into each other, and I think that cauliflower effect is giving me the shape of a tree anyway. And to bring out some highlights, I'm using the tip of a palette knife to scrape out some paint on the sides, just bringing back some white. And now I'm going to add a little bit more ultramarine blue into the mixture. Quite thick consistency this time. You can see that the paint doesn't really flow really well on the paper, and I'm using my fingers to smudge, just creating the texture of the tree. And now there's a little bit of foliage on the side, the right hand corner. So I'm quickly going to add some deep color for the shadow areas. And maybe now I can add some more water, lighten out that green. And I can also add a little bit of suggestion of foliage on the far left hand side of the building as well. And now on the reference picture, I know there is a gate over there in front of that building. I'm just going to suggest a dark shape for that gate. And I'm using the same mixture that I used on the roof. That's a mixture of Indian red and ultramarine blue, but this time very less water, a fair amount of pigment, so you can see how dark and contrasting it is compared to the building in the background. And for some shadows on the foreground, because there's a large tree in the foreground and I was sitting right under it in that shadow, I'm using purple, using ultramarine blue and permanent red. You can even use cadmium red, any sort of warm red with some ultramarine blue to give that warm shadow in the foreground. I'd also like to suggest some buildings in the background, as you can see in the reference picture, but I don't want to give a lot of details on there, so which is why I'm trying to finish it off roughly using the tip of the brush. No pencil lines there, just getting the basic shape. No details are necessary at this stage. And again, to bring back some highlight, I'm going to use my palette knife to scrape out some paint on the side of that roof. And suggesting some more details in the background, maybe a tree in the background. And now I can begin to do a little bit of the sky as well, giving a suggestion of blue sky. A quick way to suggest clouds in the sky is to lift out pigment from that wet surface. So for this, I'm using a clean, damp brush, which means there's no water on there. The brush is just damp, which means it is able to lift out some pigment from the paper. I also like to give a little bit of shadow for those clouds. So I'm using a mixture of the same blue, this was cobalt blue, with a tiny bit of orange. It has given me a nice grey shade. This color, which looks as if it's too stark right now, is going to mellow down once it dries. So I'm going to give it a few brush strokes and leave it to settle down. Now I'm going to start working on the shadows on the left side of the building. So for shadows, I'm using the same mixture of ultramarine blue and cadmium red. I'm going to use a little bit on the side of the building as well as a little bit on the ground. Now I'd like to suggest some foliage on the top right corner, and that is part of the tree under which I was sitting. I'd like to show a little bit of that, and that is in the foreground, so I've used a very deep green. And this is a mixture of sap green with a little bit of alizarin crimson red and ultramarine blue. And as you can see here, there's not a lot of water in this mixture, so I have added more pigment, very less water, to give me this darker pigment, darker color. And I'm going to let it overlap slightly on the buildings as well. It's just so that to suggest that it's in the foreground. And on the left hand side, I'm going to suggest an impression of foliage with a very watery mixture of green with a little bit of blue in it, just to suggest that things are a little bit far away in the distance. It's only a suggestion, no need for any sort of details. Again, I'm going to use my palette knife to scrape out some paint, bringing in some highlight. And now to add some spatters, just to add some texture in the foreground. And I'm also going to suggest a little bit of green color for grass in the foreground, but I'm not going to cover the area with the green. I just want to suggest the color there, and that'll be it. And now I'm going to let my watercolors dry completely before I can add a little bit of ink for some final touches. This painting is now completely dry. I'm going to use some sketch ink with my dip pen over this painting. The sketch ink that I'm using is waterproof, so in case I need to go back with watercolors, I still can do that and the ink wouldn't smudge. And I'm using a dip pen. This is one of my favorite ways of working with pen, and it gives really characteristic lines as well. So I'm only going to enhance the areas, the darker areas, the shadow areas where it's absolutely necessary. I also left the windows of the building so that I could finish it with some pen. So I'm going to continue using my pen to add a little bit more darker areas, especially the foliage or the tree in the foreground at the corner of the building. I'm going to use short lines or hatching to create a little bit of shadow and darker areas of the tree. I'm going to use a similar technique for the other areas of the building as well, especially the areas where I need to represent shadow. I hope you really enjoyed the process. Please do continue to watch to see how this turns out when I finish using ink on this painting. The reference picture is shared in my YouTube channel, which you are free to use if you'd like to sketch this. Happy painting, everyone!